Yeah. Hello and welcome to our Connect DX On-Demand expert panel on managing supply chain risk in power utilities. I'm Derek Arcuri from Genetec, and I'm joined by Patrick Miller, who's the managing partner at Archer International. Patrick, would you mind, for the benefit of our viewers, giving a quick introduction to yourself along with Archer International?
Fantastic. Sure. I am Patrick Miller, managing partner, and my background basically is I was a telecom guy in the late 80s, and then moved into the electric power space in the mid to late 90s and was there for many years. Started getting into the electric regulatory space in the early 2000s-ish, and then left and actually wrote some of the regulations and then became the first regulator for the NERC SIP standards in North America. So I've got a long history in the regulatory side. Left the regulatory space and did some cybersecurity projects for DOE and DHS. And then now I'm in consulting with Archer. And Archer is a boutique consulting firm. We've got consultants that basically answer hard questions with great answers around industrial physical security and industrial cybersecurity, as well as pretty much any regulation you can imagine for any location around the world. We've got folks that are ex-regulators and ex-compliance officers of a global nature. So we can cover pretty much any of the regulations that any of the critical infrastructure spaces might run into.
Appreciate that, Patrick. So I think it's without a doubt that over the years, the utilities industry has evolved from what once was very analog, scale-driven, centralized model to one that's distributed energy and very digital in nature. And as a result, threats are evolving, and so are regulations. So, Patrick, for our first question, could you walk us through how risks are evolving within the electric utilities?
Sure. Yeah, the power utility side, we've been dealing with digital transformation for a long time. It sounds new, but it's actually been happening for a while. A lot of the vendors have shifted from what was originally mechanical or electromechanical analog equipment to digital stuff. And it wasn't because the old stuff didn't work well or didn't last long. In fact, it still works great and still lasts a long time. It's that the digital stuff was easier to manage. It actually works better. It can offer you a much higher degree of fine tuning in how you manage your environment. It also gives you a lot more operational data about how the environment is behaving. And it gives you a greater degree and capability to control it based on all that other kind of situational awareness that you now have. So we've been doing this for a long time, and we've moved to automation many years ago. So the great thing is that a lot of the technology is now it's proven. We've had a chance to really look at the architectures, and frankly, most of it is fairly secure from an architecture and design standpoint. And, like any other industry, we still have some issues here and there, but we basically pushed the threat landscape or the vulnerability components out to the edges because we've done a fair job at actually securing the system itself. That means your best, easiest vectors in now are going to be either through the human, through phishing, or through the supply chain to get it in kind of before the utility gets a hold of it. So given the fact that we've done a good job securing the core, so to speak, now we're trying to deal with the endpoints or the periphery, which of course are, in this case for this discussion, it's supply chain. And that's a concern definitely for the power utilities.
So that's interesting. Looks like systems are secure, but the human component is obviously the potential vulnerability, and so is the supply chain. In fact, according to a recent Accenture report, it's estimated that supply chain attacks are linked to an overwhelming 40% of all breaches. And on that note, Patrick, how have regulatory bodies adapted in the power utility space?
For the power utility space, effectively FERC is the regulator for this space, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They manage this stuff for the U.S. They are the enforcement body in the U.S. for the NERC standards, the NERC SIP standards. NERC is all of North America, so there's, each country kind of manages how the NERC SIP standards unfold in their country. For us, it's FERC. The NERC SIP standards, or the critical infrastructure protection standards, speak to the physical and cybersecurity of the important stuff, the bulk electric system cyber assets. There is a new regulation, SIP 13, as it's called, is the supply chain risk management standard. I say it's new. It's been in the works for a little while. It did happen fairly quickly in terms of its drafting and ratification through FERC. But in July 1st of this year, it goes into effect, and all the utilities are required to basically have a supply chain risk management program in place, and then be using that to determine how they're going to manage those risks on the products that they buy. So at least the North American perspective is we've got a regulation, it's in place for the power side. That said, I think that given the way the infrastructure spaces work, it's likely going to go to the other verticals as well. So I would expect it to be things like oil and gas and water and chemical, though they already have in some cases their own regulations. Like chemical has CFATs, the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards. Oil and gas, there's some TSA pipeline safety regulations, but there's also very similar to the electric side. They've got their own oil and gas cybersecurity capability maturity model, or the C2M2. It's almost mirrored on the electric side. There's a lot of discussions about regulating gas-like security. So if it's not, already in your industry, it's probably coming soon to an industry near you. If you're a critical infrastructure and you're not managing supply chain, there's likely going to be a regulation that will force you to do so in the not too distant future.
Cool. And I imagine you have experience with power utilities and working on the first iteration of SIP 13. Could you, for the benefit of our viewers, could you walk us through where power utilities might have stumbled in the past?
Yeah. Probably the biggest one that they've stumbled on, and this is new for both the vendors and the utilities, and we've had lots of working group discussions and small group sessions and all kinds of things to try to get everybody up to speed. But even something as simple as just identifying what your vendor is, right? If the standard basically speaks to, you have to manage supply chain risk from your hardware, software, and service vendors, who is that? Who is the vendor? Is it Microsoft? Is it Dell? If you buy from a third party or a reseller that buys in volume and sells to you, that third party is typically just a pass-through organization, a VAR. Are they the vendor? So this is still kind of in question. The way the standard reads is it's basically who you bought it from, by and large, is how everyone is interpreting it. But for example, if you need to apply some risk management practices, do you apply it to the third party or eBay in some cases? Because there's a lot of utilities that unfortunately have to go buy a specific model, and the only place to find it is eBay, or even in Amazon in some cases. So the challenge of just determining who the vendor is even the biggest problem just right out of the gate, right? Not to mention all the other parts of the standard. So just a quick piece of advice, a simplified way for most or many to determine what the vendor is, at least to give you a first cut. Take your SIP 10 baselines, because for all BES cyber assets, and that's what the standard applies to right now, is the BES cyber assets, you have to have that as part of SIP 10 requirement 1. Take those baselines. That gives you pretty much all of the software that you've got. And if it's not an operating system, for example, anything else, where do you get that software? That would be the vendor. The hardware that all of that software lives on, there's your hardware vendors. And then, of course, any third-party service vendors that you may have that you've contracted, for example, or even your vendor contracts to support them to support you. Those would be there for the service side. And for example, PAX often has this where you have to have a licensed PAX certified third party to come work on these systems. Though PAX isn't in the version 1 standard, it will be in version 2. That's already in the process of, I guess, being scoped and drafted. The PAX and the firewall components will be in version 2. So just that one alone is a stumbling block. The other issues are just the relationship management. Since the standard applies to the utility and not the vendor, the utility has to reach out and ask the vendor lots of questions that help them meet the regulation. For example, things like incident notification. If a vendor has an incident, and for example, the vendor may be Microsoft, is Microsoft going to want to have a relationship for specific notification paths for 3,500 utilities in North America? No, they're probably going to want to have one. A smaller vendor, on the other hand, may want to have an individual path. So just trying to figure out, the large and the small of the vendor, the large and the small of the utility, whether you're a cooperative or a municipal or an investor-owned utility, you all have different procurement practices on how things are done. So this whole thing has had every utility look at it in a very different way in terms of how they're buying things. I do expect it to normalize on which vendors perform better and which ones don't with respect to the standard in terms of long-term purchase relationships, for example. But the biggest stumbling blocks we see so far are just figuring out what a vendor is and then establishing that relationship with the vendor to get the responses back that you need. And then in the event that the vendor doesn't respond, your next major hurdle is going to be doing it all yourself because the vendor is not on the hook, the utility is.
Yeah, and given that SIP 13 is so new and there's a lot of ambiguity right now, are there ways that in the effort of simplifying this, what are some potential questions that that power utilities should be asking their vendors in order to manage supply chain risk?
Right, great question. The standard requires, first of all, that you have a program in place for managing supply chain risk. And what that usually entails is you need to figure out what your vendors are doing. That means you probably need to ask them some questions, right? Not all vendors publish this information openly or make it easy to kind of wrap your arms around all of it. The standards, beyond just making you have a program in place, they give you 6 specific areas that you have to do. Basically, there's your 6 tick points that you must do, manage the risk of, for example, when you're buying. So to evaluate your vendors, I'm going to go through 6 questions that you should definitely ask. The first of which is, what is your method for notification of cybersecurity incidents? And this is, for example, an incident that the organization goes through and needs to respond to, the organization being the vendor. So the vendor gets hacked or breached, or their source code shows up on Pastebin, or their, in some cases, even things like their customer database gets leaked. Whatever that looks like in terms of an incident, how does the vendor notify you, the utility? And that's the question you should ask them. So just since you're a vendor, I'm going to ask you, how would your organization, for example, how would you as a vendor provide a notification of a cybersecurity incident to a customer?
Yeah, great question. In fact, we're very public facing, so we do have a formalized process for this. All security incidents will be published to our security advisory right on our website. So anyone can go on genetec.com, visit the Trust Center, and have a view at all of our security advisories. In addition, an email will be sent to all affected customers, and anyone can subscribe to our security advisory channel to stay on top of all of our top or all advisories.
Awesome, that's wonderful. There are various ranges. I like that approach. Some vendors require you to log in through a specific portal where you have to have licensed credentials, for example, be a paid licensee of the software. So it depends on each vendor. The public approach is by far the easiest for the utilities to actually get that information, so I appreciate that. The next question is, what is your method for notification when remote or on-site access should no longer be granted to your personnel to company systems or facilities? This one is a bit long-winded, but what it means is if the vendor has service personnel on-site at your facility, how would they notify you that that person should no longer be there? For example, maybe they've been terminated for cause or there's been an issue. For whatever reason there may be, that person needs to no longer have access to your facilities, basically, your important systems. How would the vendor notify you? This one can look very different for various organizations. So how would, for example, for Genetec respond to this one?
Well, so by default, Genetec doesn't have access to end users' systems. So in the case a support case is created, a support member will be granted access or would request access to the end customer system via BombGuard in order to troubleshoot the issue. Okay.
Yeah, and then so no on-site access then to send a technician out, for example.
No, well, since we work with our community of Genetec resellers and system integrators, that's actually something that our channel community would be managing.
Perfect. Okay, yeah, that's one of those scenarios we mentioned earlier. Okay, so the next question would be, what is your method for disclosure of known cybersecurity vulnerabilities? Different from incidents, this is vulnerabilities in the product itself. So the hardware space, typically hardware vulnerabilities, unless it's like physical locks, for example, which would be part of this, the hardware vulnerabilities would lean more toward things like firmware, EEPROM, FPROM, those kind of things. The software vulnerabilities, of course, anything that rides on top of that. When the vulnerabilities are discovered, how, and this could be through public notice, maybe a hacker has released this information, or you discovered this on your own, or a third party provided it to you. The question would go to the vendor of how does the vendor notify the customer when vulnerabilities exist in their platform? So, for example, how would Genetec respond?
Yeah, great question. So our known vulnerabilities are published on our security advisory. Same process for your first question there. But known vulnerabilities will, in conjunction to being updated on our website, which is publicly facing, it's also included in our product release notes for on-premises systems. So anyone could also subscribe to these security advisory channels to stay on top of all these advisories by email.
Awesome. Excellent. That's good. That keeps it public and keeps everybody aware. Makes it easier for the utilities that have to do this as well. The next question is, what is your method for verification and notification of software integrity? This one speaks to the potential that someone could modify the software from maybe inside your system. For example, if they've got access to your code library, or they've got access to one of your programmers, or for example, it somehow gets modified in transit between source and destination, right? We've seen situations where the code is published on a website, the website gets hacked, the code gets modified, and anybody then who downloads it gets modified code. So the question is how do they basically manage the software integrity? And this can be done lots of different ways. Many for ease, they'll use code signing or digital certificates, and others will use for a lot of times for things like standalone binaries or for ISO downloads. They'll use things like a hash algorithm, maybe SHA-2 or 3 would be a good one to look for. The one-way hashing algorithms, that way they provide the SHA, the signature, the hash signature, and then you can validate it on your end. With certificates, it's just kind of passed through. You don't get any certificate errors, and then you know everything is good. For example, how would Genetec provide, what is Genetec's method for verification and notification of software integrity?
Yeah, so all Security Center binaries are signed with Windows Authenticode technology. So this ultimately ensures that binaries from Genetec haven't been tampered with, and power utilities can enforce this check in Windows using the Windows App Locker feature. Okay,
that's good. That's a little bit easier as well because it's using the code signing and the digital certificate approach. That makes it a little more seamless. Okay, the next question would be, what methods for interactive remote access do you support? And interactive remote access in the NERC perspective or the SIP perspective is a human interacting with another system remotely. Obviously not behind the keyboard and monitor of the actual system, but coming across a wire and using something like an RDP session, TeamViewer, any one of the remote screen sharing options through WebEx or Zoom or Teams or anything like that as well, that qualifies. But that would be, somebody else operating your system remotely, interactively. What methods do you support as a vendor is something you should ask, and I'll ask Genetec as well.
Yeah, sure. So this is actually similar to my previous response. So again, in the event that a support case is created for troubleshooting reasons, a support member can be granted access again via BombGuard in order to troubleshoot the issue. Okay, that's good. That works. And the methods, the last one is, what methods for system-to-system remote access do you support? And system-to-system remote access is effectively two systems communicating without human intervention or human action. So think of this like an API that is communicating back and forth, or a database, a data pipe. It's not humans logging into a session and actually exercising mouse clicks or keyboard strokes. So in that situation, they want to know, and both of these, whether it's interactive remote access or system-to-system remote access, the reason behind this is in the supporting standards to SIP 13, SIP 5, and SIP 10.
There are regulations as well that say you need to identify these forms of access, be able to identify them quickly, and then be able to disable them in the event that you need to, right? For example, the vendor gives you a notification of an incident and you just, for the moment, want to just shut anything down. So we'll ask Genetec, what methods for system-to-system remote access do you support?
Simple answer, Genetec doesn't by default engage in system-to-system remote access.
Okay, good. That makes it easier. Makes it easier. Okay, those are the main questions we've got. And certainly that's the minimum you should be asking the vendors. You want to ask things like, do they actually have a software development lifecycle? Do they have an incident response team? If they are, for example, using anything that is data center based, you want to know, do they have something like a SOC 2 certificate, or they're ISO certified? Anything that helps you get a better picture of their position from how they're managing their own supply chain, how they're managing their people, their programmers, their code, and then how they're managing how the product actually gets to you. Again, that software integrity component. So those are all parts of what goes in. At the end of the day, in the event the vendor doesn't have great questions like you did, the utility is left holding the bag. They're on the hook. So if you ask your vendor and you get no answer, or you get answers that you're not comfortable with, as the utility, you are still required to do something. You don't have an option to just accept the risk and do nothing and move on. You do have to, because it's a risk management standard. Accepting the risk isn't part of that management approach, believe it or not, from the regulator's perspective. So that's the take-home message is hopefully you've got a vendor that's going to respond well to these questions, because your mileage may vary in terms of whether you need to do a bunch of additional controls just to meet the regulations, because the regulations are on the utility and not on the vendor.
Thanks for bringing that home. And in fact, to simplify the exchange of information between those attending the webinar, if Genetec is your current vendor, we've made a document available in the resources section of the on-demand webinar where you can download those 6 questions along with Genetec responses to speed up your efforts in complying with SIP 13. I do want to take a few seconds to actually poll the audience right now. So I'm just going to enable the first poll that we have prepared. As supply chain risk is increasing, have you started interviewing your vendors and asking them these tough questions? Responses are yes, it actually made us realize that our vendors or one of our vendors need to make changes to lower our risk. Yes, all of our vendors meet our criteria, or no, but we will soon, or no, we don't need to comply with supply chain risk regulations. I'm just going to leave that up for a few seconds so that you could respond to that poll. Now I'm going to close that poll and bring up the second poll. Would you like to learn more about how to manage supply chain risk? Answers are yes or no. So with that said, I'd like to thank you all for attending today's expert panel on demand. I'm Derek Arcuri from Genetec, and I want to thank you very much, Patrick Miller, Managing Partner at Archer International, for today's session.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. Great discussion.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks.